Arun Aryasatis, and as a futurist, I get to spend a lot of time thinking about the impact of exponential technologies on business and society. As he just shared, generative AI is one of those really interesting ones. I'm sure you've heard about ChatGPT and the launch of it as really a Sputnik moment. Everyone's talking about it. My barber was telling me about how he's using it. Literally everyone's talking about it. My grandpa is playing with ChatGPT and others image generation tools like Midjourney. So it's really arrived, but it's also, now we see companies like Google, Meta, Anthropic, Stability, OpenAI, all of them just vying for supremacy. So the question is, how will this unfold? And how might it change the world? And so that's what we're going to explore today. I would also add that I think Sulabh's already hit on the definition of generative AI. And in simple terms, I think it's also helpful to contrast it, because a common question I get is generative AI new? Is this something that's just come out? What is it? And I think it's a combination of giving it a new label, but it's, I think, helpful to contrast it from other kinds of machine learning, which were always about recognition of images or classifying data to then inform choices. And generative AI has been really interesting because it's about empowering people to create new variations from patterns that it learns in data sets. So I think it's interesting to reflect on that variation that's now really unfolding and seeing this explosion across industries. And then I think in addition to all the opportunities and excitement, there are a lot of fears. We've just seen things like the Dutch government going after some innocent citizens and prosecuting them, or we've seen something like that happen in the UK. We're also seeing some positive things. So in silico medicine has a generative AI engine to help them discover new types of molecules, which would have taken much longer. But now through something called Chemistry 42 that they've developed, they've identified this really interesting molecule that helps fight cancer. So we're seeing lots of opportunities and positive things. We're also seeing lots of risks and fear. And I'm really excited to have my two colleagues over here who have been advising clients for a very long time. We as Deloitte have been advising clients since the first industrial revolution, believe it or not, right? Over 178 years ago. And we're still here helping clients do that. And you work with clients from two different sides of industries, what I think we talked about as right-brained industries and left-brain industries. So we've got the more quantitative, decision, data-driven sort of traditional industries and financial services that my dear colleague, Toby Waldock, partner who also leads our analytics and data modernization practice. So you've been doing that for a very long time. And Paul,
thanks for reminding me.
You are most welcome. I'm sorry. And Paul Lee, you've also are a veteran of advising our tech, media, and telecoms clients globally. And maybe we could describe them more as a right-brain industry that perhaps prioritizes creativity more and storytelling, which is central, especially to the media world. We've also seen that the lines of these industries and the sectors amongst them are blurring quite a bit. So the ad industry has probably become far more quantitative in some ways. And so we're seeing some interesting patterns there. But so we're really excited to have you bring complementary perspectives and contrasting perspectives. And we're keen to discuss and debate different views over here as we talk about the business impact of generative AI. So thank you both for joining us. And yeah, so shall we jump in with some good questions? So the first one goes to you, Paul. I was just looking up some data from the 1990s. So Standard & Poor's 500, S&P 500, the top 5 companies in the 1990s. And I wrote them down. So we have ExxonMobil, IBM, General Electric, Philip Morris, and Shell. Very different from the top 5 today, right? We've got Alphabet, we've got Amazon, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Alphabet, Apple, of course, right? So we've got a very different breed of companies. So I'd love to hear from you, Paul, and then it would be great for you to weigh in as well, Toby. What parallels do you see from, the evolution of what's happened across industries over the past 25 years? Because we've seen the internet boom, we've seen the globalization of manufacturing, the rise of different countries playing a bigger role on the scene of tech. And now we're at this pivotal moment, an inflection point. So just curious on your reflections of what do you see that's parallel and maybe different?
Yeah, so when you look at the last 25 years, so if you average out in 5-year chunks, what you see is a steady rise in importance of what we would call technology companies. But within that, so within each 5-year segment, you'll have a lot of oscillation within there because the path of progress is never smooth. And if you go back to the 90s, you would have had the dot-com boom, and there were some really bad ideas there. Then shortly after that, you'd have the mobile internet boom. Remember Wireless Application Protocol, or WAP, and lots of really early ideas which didn't have the technology to match them. And you'd have early versions of things like, say, MP3 players, which were really badly designed. So within each 5-year segment, you've got a lot of oscillation. You've got a load of smoke, and you always have fire. We're in that same position right now. And, as Sullivan was saying, every day you hear something new about generative AI. And so you'll probably have a ratio of about like 10 duds for every one breakthrough. But what I find is the pace of announcements and the pace of progress is like something I've not seen for a long time. And I find there's a contrast in that in a lot of areas, we're in an era of enough, and we're also potentially on the cusp of an era of abundance enabled by things like machine vision, natural language recognition, all coming good in terms of the speed of what they can do, the cost of what they can do, and the accuracy of what they can do. Now, all of those are still to be determined, but that is what I think is promised. And so in a month's time, we'll be having a different conversation, but I think this is where we are now. And just one last reflection. I mean, right, my first ever job in technology was in 1987. I worked for IBM back then as a pre-university employee. And one thing I remember there was being shown these systems, which I was told to try and work out. And effectively, they were decision-making tools. They were very primitive forms of AI. I had no idea how to make it work. I tried to bluff it, couldn't get away with it. But effectively, that was AI back in the 80s, and it goes back even further still. So it's the same idea refined over time, which is what always happens.
Yeah, very interesting. And your point about these mini cycles within the 25-year period is a really interesting one. And I guess the trick is, how do you figure out what's the dud and what's not out of those 1 in 10, and how do you make the right bets? So really interesting point. Toby, I'm curious from your vantage point, do you agree? Do you have other reflections or observations?
So I think the commonality is human expectation and shortness of memory, right? So if you apply the hype cycle to those big booms that have occurred over that period, and I started in 1993, and one of my first tech demos at my first job was a Web 1 page on a dial-up modem. That was how we accessed the web then. And we asked the guy demoing it, what are we going to use this for? And he said, I don't know yet, but it's going to be enormous, right? That was in 1993, okay? But if you think about the expectation, there's always far too much expectation and uncertainty at the start of any hype cycle, then what happens is you have to bring that expectation down to something more manageable, then you can exploit it. And Web 1.0 was pretty much useless for businesses. Web 2 was useful for business, right? And you look at the hype around AI now, consumers are wild about it, but businesses are looking at much far-reaching questions than consumers will. Two of my children are at uni and are being told to use Midjourney and other tools. In fact, if they don't, their lecturers will be disappointed, right? So, and one of them's doing a UX design course. So, you know, it's already into universities, but it's far away from business properly yet. So we've just got to manage our expectation and remember that you can learn from those previous cycles.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point about how expectations are also going to change. So if the world is evolving in a certain way, I think our next generation needs to show up in a different way. And I've read about different universities taking a different stance. In New York, I think lots of schools have banned various tools, while there's some professors who are requiring you to use generative AI tools. And then they ask students to figure out, is this an accurate answer or is it not? So it's interesting, and we have the agency to respond and shape our response. So Toby, maybe I'll ask you the next question. I think we've hit on the potential of opportunities and how it might unfold. As advisors to very senior business leaders, I think the biggest thing that always comes up is the risk and reward equation. And specifically, if we talk about business risk, there are different elements to it. And as generative AI unlocks new things, how might it change the risk equation for leaders you advise? Because there's the reputational element to risk, there's the financial element, there's the cybersecurity part, there's environmental sustainability part. There's so many angles here. What elements strike you as interesting?
So I think I would very much tie the risk profile to essentially whether you're going to be a leader or a follower. Okay, and that will, this lead follow thing will come up, you know, again in other things I say in this conversation. A surprising number of major corporations in no way are leaders. They are very, very good followers, and that's for good reason. It's because they know that way they cannot get burnt too much by taking on too much risk up front, and then they can learn and they can improve. And that's largely tied to where you develop the first skill base. So if you think about, you know, early pioneers of the web side of things, most of them don't exist anymore, but all of the skill that was developed is in those tech companies that dominate the S&P 500. So if you think about, say, the digital boom, that digital boom went hand in hand with agile. Okay, until people learned how to do agile, they couldn't really do digital, and that's just, you know, a fact. We know that from experience, and I suspect that something very similar will be true when it comes to the reliable exploitation of AI, not the, you know, Skynet or whatever the, you know, nightmare scenarios are. So for example, just to, maybe a stupid idea, but perhaps an agile Scrum in future around AI will always need an ethics person, you know, as a standing member of that team. They will always be there to make sure that the solution is what it was meant to be, because how would you judge that now? So risk appetite is determined by a corporation about lead and follow. And then how do you execute on that? Well, if you lead and you go with the most opportunistic technology, which is AI and generative AI, then you've got to be prepared to get burned. So you've got to have an extremely good risk mitigation strategy. And at the moment, that is to get the scarcest talent, which is extremely difficult to do and very expensive. So, you know, big reward, big cost.
Yes, that's really interesting, because especially in your industry, the reward can be, and the risk are just so highly quantified, and there's so much about it, right? And it's core to the DNA. I wonder, how does that play out in TMT, Paul? Just curious if you had any views or thoughts on that in terms of the risk equation. Does it change in any way with the follower leader model?
I mean, there are massive risk questions in the industry, partly at an existential level. So one of the big risks is if we don't play in this space, do we disappear as an industry? So some of the creative industries are going, are we going to be displaced by the ability of a machine to come up with ideas? I don't think that's the case, but certainly that's one of the elements. And then within the technology elements of the TMT space, obviously there is a big challenge to keep up with everyone else. So there is these big debates as to, is generative AI something which only belongs to the biggest companies which are out there, which have access to the biggest resources and the biggest financial resources, as well as computing resources? So it's a bit of everything that's happening right now. And say, at the moment, a lot of the industry, I would say, is scrambling. I would say they are dabbling at the moment. And then over the next few months, I expect some of that dabbling, as always happens, is going to become a lot more concrete. Now, dabbling sounds a little bit perhaps pejorative, but I do think from the conversations I've had, that's where the industry is for a lot of the industry, apart from the absolute leaders which have been in the space for a long time.
Yes, I think we've heard lots of questions from various clients or even in the media about sometimes the risk being framed as humans versus AI, while I think we've generally seen it as more of a, and this is not new, but it's a framing of more as a human versus human plus AI. How do you see that sort of shaping up in your right brain industry space?
I think it's always been the case that if you are adept at using tools, you can be more productive. That's the general rule, say, for humanity, including in the TMT space. So the inflection, I'd say, around the generative AI and the creative space is, I don't think generative AI, because it is backward looking, because it's trained on a slice of knowledge, cannot create novel, new ideas, which resonate with the public. And so, the music industry, for example, is it the case that generative AI can come up with better lyrics? It can come up with decent lyrics. Can it come up with better melodies? It can come up with decent melodies, but can it come up with the combination of lyrics, melody, and the backstory that resonates, and that is slightly ahead of its time? Then that is extremely hard to do. And if you think about, most artists have a struggle to come up with a second album. And what I find with generative AI music is, like last weekend, there was lots of excitement about someone who trained a model based on Kanye West and was generating Adele covers based on that. And that was that weekend's Twitter activity for those who go on Twitter, which is a minority. And as of today, well, in fact, as of yesterday, it had all gone. We'd moved on. But still, those underlying artists generate lots of money from the original content. And it's always been the case, more and more so, that a small and small proportion of artists and tracks generate 95% of the revenues. So you've got the classic Pareto model there. And what you always find is there's always this view, in Japan, you've got artists which are avatars. It doesn't scale. That's the thing, it doesn't scale. But say somebody who has an interesting backstory, got a lot of loyalty by playing pubs and small clubs for years, went on YouTube, sort of got famous on TikTok and Instagram. They're the ones who seem to break through, but they've put years of hard work in.
Really interesting, especially your point about content and music that's created and having a human story and something you can identify and relate to is really powerful.
Yeah, and it's atoms versus electrons, right? And what the pandemic has shown is people love physicality, right? You've got to have that as your foundation, which is why Wembley can sell out for 6 nights for Coldplay. But if you tried to put that on a TV screen, you wouldn't monetize.
Yes. And Toby, I'm curious. So the financial services industry wasn't a very early adopter of trading algorithms and a lot of AI tech. how do you see generative AI playing out? We've seen Bloomberg announce a Bloomberg GPT, large language model focused on finance things. If you had to imagine or see, is there anything that comes to your mind that might play out in a strange way?
So I suppose in one way, what you could say is that financial services broadly was overdue this next wave, because it was actually sometime in the 90s that hedge funds really started to become something material, using, you know, quant techniques and having access to compute power. So that's been the case for some time, and everyone now, of course, that's the norm in the market. There are plenty of other, you know, algorithmic trading. You know, you'll get a better financial result if your compute is closer to the exchange. Literally, you know, where can you rent that's closer? That was how they made more money on Wall Street in the 2000s. But for example, in insurance, in the last 18 months, there's been the example of Brit working with Google and others, set up a follow syndicate, a follow syndicate called Kai. That is running on a very reduced headcount. It's within 18 months exceeded its premium targets of 800 million per annum. And so the question is naturally now is, because that's more kind of just pre-LLM technology. So could you now do a lead syndicate with the new technology that's available now? And that's the question that is being explored in the special risks market. And it's exactly the natural thing that you would explore. Or another example would be catastrophe modeling. You know, that's just a compute power question, and being able to hoover up all the data, right? That is a brilliant use case for this, because we all know hurricanes are going to happen. The trick is to know precisely when, how badly, and is it going to do this? You know, and that's what everyone's trying to model. That is a perfect use case for these sorts of technologies.
That's so interesting to see how different parts of the business industries are experimenting with generative AI, and we might see new types of things within the world of generative AI and other kinds of AI that will multiply the possibilities as well. I wanted to come back to our earlier point about human versus human plus AI. And if we reflect as how organizations have evolved, and Toby, you mentioned, imagine hypothetically the equivalent of a Scrum team then having a dedicated ethicist. What might, and this is a question for both of you, what might teams look like in the future, in the near future, in the context of generative AI? What might new roles emerge because of the shifting ways of work? We've talked about graphic designers now needing to at least try things in something like Midjourney. What might organizational structures look like? And what might leadership look like in a world where generative AI is just ubiquitous?
I always knew that being a philosophy graduate would pay off one day, and this is that moment.
Great.
Now here. So the point about ethics cannot be, I think, it can't be overstated, right? Because I think it's tied to your question's a great one, because you're asking about the specific roles that may exist. Let's assume there was an ethics person on that Scrum team, but then the question of leadership, and I'm speaking for my industry now, Paul, when I say that the ability for insurers in particular to harness a culture of experimentation and innovation, it's not good, right? Can you imagine a Scrum team that's focused around this technology, with asking all the right questions, taking that up the chain to, you know, with in loose terms, a business case to go into production? How are they going to have that conversation with people who are not conversant? It's kind of, there are parallels with early days of digital, perhaps, but the difference here is, you know, the risk profile is very different. You know, human opinion, second opinion. How do you get second opinion on what an AI model has said? Do you do it without AI tech? Then can you scale that? How does it work? How do you test it? You know, all those questions exist in where the change is done, but also right up to the top of the leadership of the company and the board. And, you know, what will happen to the share price?
Yeah, and your point about the culture thing is going to be so important and challenging and will unfold quite interestingly in different existing cultures. Like the actuarial science culture is one sort. It's very different, let's say, from a creative music studio. Paul, what are your thoughts and views on that question?
So if I can give one example, which is often given as an example of a trade which has been made obsolete, but I don't think it actually has done. So a few days ago, I went to a local museum, which very few people know about. It's actually the BT Museum. It's a museum of telephony. And one thing I tried out there was effectively a very primitive exchange. So where you physically connect calls together. Now, in a sense, that role has disappeared, but you have call centers. And there was a time about 25, 30 years ago when call centers became computerized, and you had a combination of the call center and computers to enable the call center agent to have a ready-made script every time that person lifted the phone. And it was the same kind of role. So sitting at a desk in front of a telephone, but it was upgraded. And I can see generative AI upgrading that again to create better scripts. So the underlying role, which is having somebody make a call to generate an outcome, remains, because you always need that. And if it's selling, if it's technical support, then what the humans got is the ability to empathize, which a computer can't necessarily do. So, that's one possible outcome. And I think another possible outcome is there will be certain categories of job which disappear. And talking to some companies, say in the media part, so advertising, there's roles which are sketch artists, which have very quickly become obsolete. So that's one part of, the TMT industry is really heterogeneous, and that's one element of it. And there are roles which effectively have been written off within a few months because of the capabilities of one tool. The caveat being, they don't know what the copyright rules are of using some of the outputs from generative AI, because you can't copyright an output from a machine in certain jurisdictions. So we still have to wait and see.
Yeah, really interesting. Maybe the final question then is, it's more about how value is in the eye of the beholder. And in the context of business value and supply and the value chain, anytime there's new tech, it changes that. So is there an aspect in your industry, Toby, for instance, that you're curious or you've got a hunch about how that might shift?
So I think that I have an observation which is connected. When Google became a big deal, the insurance industry was worried that Google would become an insurer. And Google quickly realized that would be a stupid idea. Okay. And what they've realized, much as Microsoft realized very, very well, was that it is much better to be relevant to your sector and to work in partnership with that sector and be adopted very well than it is to try and displace them. So I think that the value chain is actually more stable now in some respects than it was when the FANGs became a big deal. And I think that stability will play very well to the hype cycle, which is explosion of ideas and then consolidation. And I think that they'll consolidate back into the FANGs, working with the sectors, which is kind of how business needs to be.
Fascinating. Well, a massive thank you to both of you. I think my big takeaway is with generative AI, there's a new type of change coming. We're all used to change as business advisors. And the question is the degree of uncertainty which we don't like, our clients don't like, and how do we navigate that? It's really asking these sorts of questions.